Picture this: a short, angry man in a funny hat, hand stuffed inside his coat, stomping around Europe trying to prove he's bigger than he really is. That's the Napoleon you know. The tiny tyrant, the pint-sized emperor. The man whose name became a psychological condition for short guys with attitude problems. There's just one tiny problem with that picture: Napoleon wasn't short. In fact, by the standards of his own time, he was perfectly average, maybe even slightly above average. So how did one of the most powerful men in history become the world's most famous short guy? The answer involves a measurement mix-up, a British cartoonist with a vendetta, 2 centuries of bad history teaching, and a psychology term that should probably be retired. Stick with me, because this story is going to change the way you look at history forever. Let's start with the actual numbers. When Napoleon Bonaparte died on the island of St. Helena in 1821, the French doctor performing his autopsy recorded his height as 5 feet 2 inches. That sounds tiny, right? Almost comically small, and for nearly 2 centuries, that number has been used as proof that the emperor was a shrimp. But here's where things get interesting. That measurement was in French units. The French inch, called a pouce, was longer than the English inch. About 1 inch in French equaled roughly 1.06 inches in English. When you do the actual math, Napoleon's true height comes out to about 5 feet, 6 or 7 inches in modern measurements. That's roughly 168 to 170 centimeters. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but 5 to 6 is still pretty short, right? And by today's standards, sure, it's below average. But we're not living in today. We're talking about France in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The average height for a Frenchman in that era was around 5 feet, 5 inches. Some studies place it even lower. Soldiers in Napoleon's own armies typically stood between 5 to 3 and 5 to 6. So Napoleon wasn't just average, he was actually a bit taller than the average Frenchman of his time. He wasn't the runt of the litter. He was, height-wise, just a normal guy, maybe even slightly imposing. So, if Napoleon wasn't actually short, why does everybody think he was? This is where the story gets really fun. Meet James Gillray. Gillray was a British political cartoonist working in London during Napoleon's rise to power. He absolutely hated Napoleon. He despised everything the French emperor represented, and he had a weapon that turned out to be more powerful than any cannon satire. Gillray drew Napoleon over and over again as a tiny, ridiculous, tantrum-throwing little man. He gave him an oversized hat, a stubby body, and a furious expression. He called him Little Boney. The cartoons were vicious, hilarious, and wildly popular across Britain and beyond. People couldn't get enough of them. Now imagine you're an average European in the early 1800s. You've never seen Napoleon in person. You're probably never going to see him. You don't have photographs. You don't have video. The only image of him you've ever encountered is in a satirical cartoon where he looks like an angry toddler in a military uniform. That image gets burned into your brain. You pass it on to your children. They pass it on to theirs. By the time we reach the 20th century, the cartoon caricature has completely replaced the historical reality. Napoleon the man has become Napoleon the meme, and that meme says he was tiny. The British propaganda machine had a field day with this. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was at war with France for over a decade. They needed to make their enemy look weak, ridiculous, and beatable. What better way than to portray him as a furious little man having tantrums while real adults defeated him on the battlefield? It was psychological warfare, and it worked beautifully. Long after Napoleon was dead, long after Britain had won, the image stuck. The truth didn't matter. The story was too good. But Gillray and the British weren't the only ones to blame. There's another factor that contributed to the myth, and it's actually kind of charming. Napoleon was almost always surrounded by his Imperial Guard. These were elite soldiers, handpicked for their physical presence. They were tall, like, really tall by the standards of the time. Many of them stood over 6 feet. They were bodyguards, status symbols, and walking propaganda all rolled into one. Now imagine a 5'6" emperor standing next to a wall of 6-foot-plus giants. He'd look small by comparison, wouldn't he? Even if he was perfectly average for his era. People who saw Napoleon in person often commented that he seemed smaller than expected, but what they were really seeing was an optical illusion created by the absolute units he chose to surround himself with. There's also the matter of his nickname. The French called him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. To English ears, that sounds like a comment on his height, but that's not what it meant at all. In French military tradition, calling someone Petit was a term of affection. It was the way you'd talk about a beloved younger brother or a cherished friend. The Little Corporal was a name his soldiers gave him out of love and respect, because he had risen through the ranks alongside them. It was a sign of intimacy, not insult. But over the centuries, the nuance got lost in translation, and English speakers heard it as proof that he was small. Here's where things get really interesting. The myth of Napoleon's short stature didn't just stick around as a historical curiosity. It actually gave birth to a whole concept in pop psychology. You've probably heard of it, the Napoleon complex. The idea is that short men, particularly short men with power, overcompensate for their lack of height by being aggressive, domineering, and ambitious. The very name of this supposed condition uses Napoleon as the archetype, the classic case. The patron saint of small, angry men. But if Napoleon wasn't actually short, then the foundation of the entire concept is built on a lie, and researchers have started to notice. Modern psychological studies on the Napoleon complex have produced surprisingly mixed results. Some studies find that shorter men are no more aggressive than taller men. Other studies suggest that what we interpret as overcompensation is often just normal human ambition that happens to be exhibited by someone who's also short. The connection between height and personality is far weaker than the stereotype suggests. Some psychologists have even argued that the Napoleon complex shouldn't be considered a real psychological phenomenon at all. It's just a cultural prejudice dressed up in pseudo-scientific language. Think about that for a moment. We have a psychological condition named after a historical figure who didn't actually have the trait the condition describes. It's like naming a condition the Einstein effect, because we mistakenly believe Einstein was bad at math. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The whole thing falls apart. Now let's talk about who Napoleon actually was, beyond the myth. Because when you strip away the cartoonish caricature, what you find is one of the most extraordinary military commanders in human history. He rose from a minor noble family on the island of Corsica to become emperor of the French at age 34. He revolutionized warfare, designing tactics that military academies still study today. He created the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that became the foundation for civil law in much of the modern world. He reformed education, taxation, and government bureaucracy in ways that shaped Europe for centuries to come. His armies, at their peak, controlled most of continental Europe. He fought against coalitions of every major power on the continent, often simultaneously. He won battles that should have been mathematically impossible. He lost battles too, of course, including the catastrophic invasion of Russia and his final defeat at Waterloo. But by any reasonable measure, the man was a giant of history, just not a literal giant. Or a literal dwarf. So what can we learn from all of this? A few things, actually. First, history is written by the storytellers, not the statisticians. A good cartoon can outlive the truth by centuries. Second, we should be careful with the labels we inherit. The Napoleon complex sounds scientific, but it's really just a piece of British propaganda that wandered into psychology textbooks and got comfortable. Third, our perceptions of historical figures are often shaped by people who had every reason to lie about them. Look hard enough, and you'll find that almost every famous person from the past has at least one widely believed myth attached to their name. Napoleon was not short, he was average. He was, by some measures, slightly taller than the men around him. The myth of his shortness was a joke that got out of hand, a piece of propaganda that worked too well, a measurement error that nobody bothered to correct. And yet that myth has shaped how we think about height, power, and personality for over 200 years. The next time someone tells you a man is acting like he has a Napoleon complex, you can smile a little, because you'll know the secret. The complex is named after a man who wasn't actually small, invented by enemies who wanted him to seem smaller than he was, and inherited by all of us through a chain of mistranslations and political cartoons. If this changed the way you see history, subscribe. We break down one mind-blowing myth every week and show you the truth hiding behind the story. Because the world is stranger, funnier, and more fascinating than the textbooks ever told you.